Hello, students. I am Vidya from English Magus. Welcome back to another exciting lesson. Today, we are diving into the heartwarming and humorous story, A Triumph of Surgery, by James Herriot. It's a delightful tale about an overpampered dog, his worried mistress, and a very clever vet. Let's explore how love, care, and a bit of tough love lead to a miraculous recovery. Before we get into the story, let's acquaint ourselves with the author. James Herriot, the pen name of James Alfred White, was a British veterinary surgeon and beloved author. Born on 3 October 1916, in Sunderland, England, he wrote autobiographical tales of a vet's life in Yorkshire. His works, including All Creatures Great and Small, charmed millions worldwide until his death in 1995. Now, let's get an overview of the story. The central character, Tricky, was a small, spoiled dog. His wealthy owner, Mrs. Pumphrey, fed him all kinds of rich food, cream cakes, chocolate, and more, thinking she was helping him. But instead, she made him dangerously overweight and ill. Before we begin, I recommend pausing the video to read the text on each slide for a better understanding. The story begins with Mr. Herriot, the narrator, describing his shock at seeing Tricky on the street with Mrs. Pumphrey. Tricky looked like a bloated sausage with legs. His eyes were red and watery, and his tongue was hanging out. Clearly, Tricky was in poor health. Mr. Herriot spoke to Mrs. Pumphrey, who explained that Tricky seemed tired and weak. Believing he was malnourished, she fed him extras like malt, cod liver oil, and Horlicks. Mr. Herriot asked if she had followed his earlier advice to cut back on sweet treats. In response, Mrs. Pumphrey admitted that she had tried to cut down on sugary treats but gave in because Tricky seemed too weak. She said he loved cream cakes and chocolate. Mr. Herriot observed that Tricky's problem was greed, as he never refused food. When asked about exercise, Mrs. Pumphrey mentioned short walks, but nothing more because her gardener was ill. Mr. Herriot warned her to reduce Tricky's food and increase his exercise to prevent serious illness. Mrs. Pumphrey agreed but struggled to follow the advice. Mr. Herriot watched Tricky struggle in his harness and coat, anticipating a call from Mrs. Pumphrey soon. Sure enough, she called, distraught that Tricky wasn't eating and was vomiting. He was also lethargic and uninterested in walks. Mr. Herriot suggested hospitalization for 2 weeks. Mrs. Pumphrey panicked, fearing Tricky would pine for her. But Mr. Herriot remained firm, insisting it was necessary to save Tricky. Mrs. Pumphrey became emotional as she packed Tricky's belongings, throwing his coats out the window in despair. As Mr. Herriot drove to the surgery with the weak Tricky beside him, the little dog managed a feeble tail wag, showing his trust in the vet. At the clinic, the household dogs surrounded Tricky, but he was too exhausted to interact. The other dogs lost interest in him quickly. Mr. Herriot prepared a comfortable spot for Tricky, watching him closely. For 2 days, Tricky received only water, no food. By the 3rd day, he started showing signs of recovery, paying attention to the other dogs. When the door was opened, Tricky followed the dogs out into the yard, wobbling due to his weight. During feeding time, Mr. Herriot watched Tricky explore the empty bowls. The next day, Tricky had his own bowl and began to eat with the other dogs. Tricky's recovery accelerated. Without any medicine, he played with the other dogs, became more active, and even hunted rats at night. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pumphrey continued to call for updates, but Mr. Herriot reassured her that Tricky was safe and improving rapidly. Mrs. Pumphrey started sending eggs, wine, and even brandy to help build up Tricky's strength, though it was Mr. Herriot and his team who enjoyed these treats. After 2 weeks, Tricky was fully recovered. He had transformed into a fit, agile dog. When Mrs. Pumphrey arrived, Mr. Herriot reassured her that Tricky was fine. As soon as Tricky saw Mrs. Pumphrey, he leapt into her arms, brimming with energy. Mrs. Pumphrey was overwhelmed with gratitude, calling his recovery a triumph of surgery, even though it was Mr. Herriot's simple plan of diet and exercise that had saved him. Now that you've understood the story, think about this. Are there moments in your life where you or someone else was pampered too much? Remember, not everything that feels good is actually good for us. Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fun and insightful lessons. And that's it for today.